Hi guys, my name is Christine. For those of you who do not know me, I have a background in psychology. I did IB psychology in high school. I have a bachelor's in psychobiology and a master's in brain and cognition and society. And I was watching this John Oliver clip this morning about critical race theory, and there was this one particular psychological experiment that they referenced that I thought would be worth some discussion. Let me roll the clip here.
Another classic lesson over the years has been to teach about prejudice metaphorically by dividing a classroom up by eye colour, with brown-eyed people, for instance, being the lowest tier and then being treated terribly. And if you do that in a diverse classroom and think for even a second about who is more likely to have brown eyes, you can probably immediately see just how badly that lesson could go. That actually happened in at least one school in the Chicago area, and the reason I know that is that this kid was in the class that day, and she's one of our writers now. Ali, what did you think of that lesson?
It was pretty fucked up.
Yeah, I bet it was.
So this clip is addressing the implementation of the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment, which is an exercise developed by Jane Elliott, who was a teacher back in 1968. And this is one of the experiments, or exercises rather, that really got me interested in psychology research in high school. And so to hear it being talked about in such a negative light was kind of an interesting thing to me. And I figured it would be worth a bit of a breakdown, a bit of a discussion. So that's kind of what I'm aiming to do here. So the original exercise was not actually psychological research as such. It wasn't performed in a lab. It was just an exercise devised by a school teacher, Jane Elliott, who was teaching third graders in Iowa back in the 1960s. In 1968, in the wake of the Martin Luther King assassination, she got a lot of questions from her students about, what was happening, what was going on, and she didn't really have the toolkit to explain racism to them, so instead she devised this exercise that would emulate racism in the classroom in a way that those children would hopefully understand and take with them. So things I'll be covering in this video are, first of all, what was the original exercise, what was its intent, and how was it carried out? What field of psychology is this in? After that, why did it not work in the context of Ali Barthwell, the writer of John Oliver's TV show? And then lastly, can this activity still be implemented in the 21st century with any type of success? So first, let's talk about what the actual exercise was itself. So luckily for us, there is actually like a full film documentary about this exercise and the consequences of it for Jane Elliott's kids in her classroom. It's a 53-minute film where you can see exactly what happened. I'll link it through in the description, but it's available here to watch free on YouTube. So what's important to know here, and this is something we'll come back to a couple times in my explanation, is that the class that she had was a homogenous group. So this was a group that was similar in traits. All the kids were white. They were likely at a similar socioeconomic status. The only real prejudicial difference was gender at the time, but there was no kind of racial difference within the group itself. What Jane Elliott did is she divided the class into two groups based on a superficial trait, or a trait that was superficial to these kids, in which case, this case it was eye color. It could have been, anything. It could have been hat color, shoelace length, anything that would have been superficial and not, related to some kind of underlying bias in the class. Now, it's not really clear to me, at least from what I've seen, what the opening group was, so which group was superior first, the brown eyes or the blue eyes. In the articles that I've read, it starts with brown eyes being superior, although in the documentary film on YouTube, it starts with the blue eyes being superior. Again, conceptually, if the starting point is truly superficial, then it doesn't matter which group is put as superior first. Then after creating this kind of superficial divide between the two groups, she would make up a reason for one group being a better group, the superior group to the other group, for them being more well-behaved or maybe being more responsible. For example, in the opening of the film, the Blue Eyes group is considered the more responsible and the more well-behaved one, so they are allowed more playtime at recess, more privileges within the classroom, while the Brown Eyes group has their privileges taken away from them. They even made, Jane even made the brown-eyed children wear bracelets made of construction paper to signify to everyone which group they belong to. This is, of course, reminiscent of the yellow badges that the Jewish individuals were forced to wear in parts of the Middle Ages and most notably during the Second World War. Now, the outcome of this is that although the children initially kind of seem hesitant to believe that there is a true reason for dividing these two groups, regardless of their perception of it, they grow into their roles quite quickly. So blue-eyed children in the start of the film, for example, propose new rules to restrict the privileges of the brown-eyed children on top of the rules that are already being enforced by the teacher. And the term brown-eyed becomes a bit of a slur within the classroom, which is quite interesting. So the brown-eyed children often, of course, felt very left out. So the split between these two groups really permeates throughout their kind of entire social structure. It affects their playtime, it affects their friendships, and it really just affects all of the interactions within the class. There were even reports of children having fistfights during recess over these superficial divisions that have been created. So the next day, Jane Elliott switched the privileges from one group to the other group. So the inferior group becomes the superior group and vice versa. And then noted, of course, the same effects of the children, embracing their roles and treating their peers differently based on the superficial groupings they've been allocated to. And also just a note about something that John Oliver mentioned in his video is he states that the inferior groupings were treated terribly.
Brown-eyed people, for instance, being the lowest tier and then being treated terribly.
He says this as if the teachers instruct the children to act in prejudicial ways towards one another. This isn't the case, of course. It's merely that the teachers are creating a difference and implementing a set of privileges that will exacerbate that difference. But that terrible treatment, the difference in behavior, like the name-calling, the fighting, that's all outcome of the scenario. That's all children building behavior themselves because of the circumstances that they're in, but that's not actually the teachers enforcing that behavior. The teachers aren't telling the children to be mean to each other. That's just kind of a product of the environment that they're being put in. And that's, of course, part of the reason why this is such a fundamentally interesting exercise. So let's talk a little bit more about the field of psychology that this would fall under. This exercise is a demonstration of in-group and out-group dynamics. It's part of social identity theory, which falls under social psychology or sociology. It's been explicitly researched since the 1970s, and since the early 2000s, we've been doing brain imaging research like fMRI studies on this as well, for example, with the FFA. The point being that this is a generally well-researched field, and there are a couple fundamental ideas that we know about this field, about in-group and out-group dynamics, such as the following three. First of all, in-group favoritism. So the in-group, of course, is the group that you belong to. So let's say you are someone with blue eyes. In the case of Jane Elliott's example, you would be within the blue eyes in-group, and then the brown eyes group would be the out-group towards you. So the first point being in-group favoritism. So this means that people are more likely to be kind and act with empathy and with trust towards people within their in-group. The second point being out-group derogation. This means that you're more likely to treat your out-group with distrust, to perceive them as threatening, and to generally just not really like them as much as you like people who are in your in-group. And the last point, and arguably the most interesting point, is that you can create an effective in-group and out-group dynamic based on just about anything. You can take 30 people and ask them what their preference is between two abstract paintings, and then based on that, those two groups that you create through that paradigm, they will show the in-group and the out-group favoritism and biases. So this makes sense as a topic that is very important to learn about within education, right? It means we create biases very quickly, and more often than not, our biases are detrimental to how we treat people who are not like us. You can probably think of a couple of kind of standout examples of in-group and out-group dynamics. For example, racism, sexism, religious prejudice, radical nationalism. These are all very clear examples. But this theory also explains violence between, for example, sports fans, rivalry between schools and colleges, even how we treat people who have different tastes in movies or music than us. So you can imagine why this, of course, is a really important concept for us to learn about as kids and for kids to learn about in school. For example, with anti-bullying messaging, just because somebody looks different or likes different things to you doesn't mean you can't be friends or have fun playing together. Now, it's understandable why some teachers would want to use this as an activity to, explain racism to a younger group of kids that does not quite yet have the vocabulary to talk about it at length. However, this is not always an effective method, and we're now going to talk a little bit about why it did work in the context of Jane Elliott, but did not work in the context of Ali Barthwell. So let's start with Jane Elliott's class. So her third grade class was a school in a small town of Iowa with a population of about 800 back in 1968. So in this context, she had a homogeneous group. All of the kids in her class were pretty much virtually the same in terms of race and socioeconomic status. And eye color, because of this, was a truly superficial trait. Eye color was equal in kind of superficiality to, for example, shoelace length. It really was just a random grouping of people. Now, John Oliver's writer Ali Barthwell, on the other hand, likely attended school in the 90s in Chicago. In 1990, Chicago had a population of almost 3 million with a huge variety of ethnic groups. And for example, the 2019 census shows a very mixed demographic still in this area, which means if you were to copy-paste Jane Elliott's original experiment from 1968 to 1990 Chicago, it's pretty much just a recipe for disaster. The basis of this experiment is that a superficial difference is introduced into an otherwise homogeneous group. But in a classroom in an urban and multicultural region like Chicago, which will not have a homogeneous mix of children to begin with, and on top of that, eye color would not be a superficial trait, again, because eye color, as John Oliver mentions in the clip, is going to be linked to certain racial groups, so some racial groups will be more likely to have that eye color than others. Really, all you'll end up with is a group of children who already have a number of social cultural differences ingrained within them. And then you'll be splitting them based on traits that reflect those social cultural differences. So the kids are not on equal footing to begin with, and the change that you're introducing isn't a superficial one. And obviously, as we have seen in the case of Ali Barthwell, this can lead to a number of adverse outcomes. For example, traumatizing these children, leading them to, exacerbate the social cultural differences between them, and really not being an effective way to open a dialogue about race or racism. So the real question now is there any way to truly implement this exercise in the 21st century and have it be effective at all? This is a really different question, and this is going to be up to your personal opinion. And my background is more of that in psychology than it is in education. So this is going to be very much open to personal opinion, and I would love to hear your thoughts below. But I think the only context in which this could still be an effective experiment is if you truly do have a homogenous group, maybe if you live in a very rural region where everybody in your population, in your local population, is quite similar in terms of status, in terms of race, religion, ethnicity. Even then, if you were to implement this again, I don't think eye color is something that is superficial enough. You would almost have to do it based on something really silly that you determine in the class itself. For example, if you have everybody pick a number out of a hat and you have like the ones versus the twos. However, of course, it's exceedingly unlikely for kids to be growing up in an environment that is entirely homogenous in that sense. And of course, another thing to keep in mind is that our ethics requirements are, of course, a lot stronger now than they were in the 60s. So if you are going to potentially traumatize a group of kids by having them be prejudicial towards each other, in this day and age, that's probably not going to be advised or accepted in classrooms the same way that it would have been 50 years ago. One thing to take away from this experiment, though, is even if this exercise is not really viable in the modern day and age in terms of education, it still teaches us a lot about how kids respond to prejudice, and the fact that they were able to talk about it, to articulate some basic understanding of prejudice at such a young age really should indicate to us as educators that we shouldn't be afraid of breaching these topics with younger kids. And especially given younger children will have exposure and access to the internet, it's very likely that even if you are in a homogenous population, local population of some kind, given they'll have access to the internet, they'll most likely see and hear about the experiences of kids who don't look like them, who look different to them, who have different beliefs to them, who have different everyday lives, cultures, norms, food to them. And that's something they're going to want to talk about. So providing an open platform with which they can kind of breach these topics and talk about them comfortably is going to be really important in education moving forward. So even if we don't take this activity with us moving forward, it is still really important to think about the fact that kids do see and understand prejudice at this age, and it is an important topic to be talked about within the classroom. But the brown eyes and blue eyes experiment might not be the way to do that. Thank you for listening to my brief little mini rant about the blue eyes brown eyes experiment. I hope you learned something from this video, or even if you didn't and you already knew about the brown eyes blue eyes experiment, I hope it has encouraged you to think about its implementation in education and how this can be changed moving forward. I'd love to hear from you guys if you have any thoughts on if and when and how this activity can still be relevant for us today, or if it should just be taken off the table entirely. So let me know in the comments. Or don't. Bye.